Why did the silence feel heavier than the impact? Lieutenant Avery Hale, 26 years old, sat perfectly still in the Stark Hospital office, her ribs bound tight and her left wrist locked in a heavy cast. Every breath was a stab of hot, blinding pain, yet her face was a mask of cold composure. 3 days earlier, on a routine Wednesday afternoon in Jefferson Hall, 3 senior cadets at Raven Ridge Military Academy had decided to teach her a lesson. They sneered the words, "Women don't belong at Raven Ridge," before one of them shoved her. Avery, an infantry officer who had led 30 soldiers through the hostile, ambush-laden alleys of Karash province, tumbled backward. Her ribs slammed the stone edge. Her wrist snapped as she hit the steps. She fell 6 stairs before the pain finally exploded and stole her breath. She had survived a deployment to a war zone. She was a tactical officer chosen to mentor the next generation, yet she had been taken down by 3 arrogant, resentful students. The military police investigator across the desk was courteous, but the doubt in his eyes was a thick, bitter taste. He asked if she had provoked them. He asked if she was certain it wasn't an accident. Avery was among the few women in a position of authority on post, and she felt, deep in her gut, the sickening shift of the battle. It was no longer about the attack, it was about proving her right to be there. She named the cadets Ethan Ward, Noah Briggs, and Ryan Tate. She laid out the facts like brass casings on a table, deliberate, targeted, unprovoked. She refused the offered painkillers. The pain, she realized, was a vital fuel. She needed to remember every single second. Her father, Captain Miles Hale, had been killed in Karash when she was 14, a Special Forces captain who earned a Silver Star. Her grandfather was General Colin Hale, a retired legend whose very name opened doors. Avery had grown up with expectation. She knew her commission came with a target on her back, but she hadn't expected the betrayal to come from those she was meant to guide. She thought about her father's final lesson. The hardest part of leadership is earning trust from those who doubt you from the start. You don't make them believe, he had said. You just prove them wrong again and again. She felt a profound, aching sense of being ignored, not by the enemy overseas, but by the very system she had committed her life to upholding. But there was something she hadn't told the investigator, not yet. Why was her own documentation being weaponized against her? The next morning, the call came from the legal office at Raven Ridge. The 3 cadets Ward, Briggs, and Tate had filed a counter-complaint: harassment, professional misconduct. They claimed she had targeted them for weeks out of personal bias, insisted the stairwell fall was an accident, and that she had exaggerated her injuries to fabricate a false story. Avery felt her chest tighten in cold shock. The legal officer explained they had statements from other cadets and were launching a full review. Worse, they were using her own disciplinary reports, the write-ups for failing inspection and insulting a female cadet, as proof of her hostility. Her documentation was being twisted against her. The system was not protecting her. It was attempting to dissolve her narrative into a messy, bureaucratic fog. Until the investigation concluded, she was moved to administrative duties and ordered not to contact the accused. Avery felt an overwhelming sense of anxiety and injustice. She realized her quiet endurance, her determination to just keep going, a quality she had honed by running until her legs quit, and then running anyway, was being interpreted as vindictiveness. She was a combat veteran, one of the youngest tactical officers who had graduated in the top 15% of her class, yet she was being sidelined, her reputation under attack by 3 weak leaders. She knew she was right, but without proof, the system would chew her up. She had vowed at her father's funeral to finish what he had begun, and that promise felt impossible now, trapped in a legal labyrinth. She hadn't wanted to, but she had no options left. Avery reached for the phone and dialed her grandfather's number. She was about to introduce a variable into the equation that transcended the rules of the academy. Answered on the second ring. Avery laid out the entire situation, every detail, every counterclaim, every fact, in the same cool, emotionless tone she would use for an after-action report. No tears, no anger, just clinical data. General Colin Hale stayed silent for a long moment. Then just 3 words spoken with the quiet, devastating finality of a command. "I'll handle it." The next morning, a black SUV rolled right through the main gates of Raven Ridge. No appointment, no warning. 3 men in civilian suits walked directly into the superintendent's office. One was a retired 4-star general, a peer of Colin Hale. Another was a current 2-star who had once served alongside Avery's father, Captain Miles Hale. The third represented the Office of Military Oversight. This was not a complaint. This was an intervention. Within an hour, the 3-star general who served as superintendent triggered an emergency lockdown. Every single gate sealed shut. All movement on post froze. Classes stopped. Every cadet was confined to barracks. The determination of her family, that silent, legendary weight of the Hale name, was now operating outside the standard chain of command. The 3 cadets had failed to realize that some families remember. They had made a powerful enemy. Avery felt a dangerous flicker of pride and relief. Her struggle was no longer solitary. The mystery of the 3 sudden generals was now the central focus of the base, and the quiet investigation that had failed her was about to become an overwhelming, unstoppable search for the truth. What they found in the next 48 hours sealed the fate of the 3 cadets. The high-level investigation team, backed by the pressure of the sealed gates, moved with ruthless efficiency. They secured surveillance footage, phone logs, and multiple witness statements. They uncovered exactly what Avery already knew. The attack was not spontaneous. The cadets had planned it for weeks. Text messages were recovered, showing them mocking Avery, strategizing ways to drive her out of the academy. The security footage captured them waiting at the top of the stairwell, deliberately blocking her path, and then the intentional, violent shove. The chain of custody for the phone data was airtight, lawfully seized. The proof was overwhelming. The narrative of a simple, tragic accident collapsed instantly. Avery, still recovering, felt a sense of vindication that tasted sharper than the painkillers she had refused. Her initial broken state, physical and emotional, had been the catalyst for an overwhelming surgical response. Within days, Ward, Briggs, and Tate were taken into custody by military police and marched off campus in handcuffs. Their commissioning was revoked. They were administratively separated pending court-martial. Their families, desperate, tried to intervene, hearing lawyers and crying misunderstanding, but the facts were cold and absolute. Formal charges were filed under the Uniform Code of Military Justice: assault, conduct unbecoming, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The quiet, methodical truth-seeking had triumphed over the loud, chaotic lie. She was summoned to the superintendent's office. The 3 generals were waiting. Her grandfather, General Colin Hale, was deliberately absent, allowing the system to correct itself without the shadow of his direct influence. The superintendent, a 3-star general, looked Avery in the eye, offering no vague speech. He gave her a personal apology, a rare and heavy acknowledgement that the system had failed her. He explained that the quick, decisive investigation had exposed a deeper, toxic pattern of harassment against other female cadets and officers. Immediate reforms were already being rolled out. Avery felt a quiet wave of pride, not for her family's intervention, but because her personal battle had forced a systemic shift. He then gave her a choice, an unprecedented offer. She could stay at Raven Ridge and continue as a tactical officer with the full, explicit backing of the leadership. Or she could transfer anywhere she wished, with an included promotion and commendation. No strings attached, no pressure. The system, broken by 3 cowardly seniors, was now desperate to make it right. Avery stayed. She refused the transfer and the easy promotion. She would not allow 3 cowards to drive her from the place her father had once hoped to see her thrive. She returned to duty, her left wrist still encased in white plaster, her ribs still mending. The pain was still there, a dull, insistent ache, but it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a foundation. Her inner conflict, the battle between her lineage and her self-worth, had been resolved in the cold, hard light of the investigation. She was there because she had earned it, not because of her last name. The cadets under her watch looked at her differently now, not with pity but with a deep, silent respect. They had witnessed the entire sequence, the cheap shot, the bureaucratic pushback, and the sudden, overwhelming counterstrike of justice. They had seen her stand firm, a silent pillar of resolve. The months that followed were characterized by a quiet, unrelenting finality. The three attackers faced their courts-martial. All three were convicted. Ethan Ward received 6 months confinement and was dismissed from service. Noah Briggs and Ryan Tate shared similar sentences, their records permanently marked, their names scrubbed from the rolls of Raven Ridge. Their families appealed, but the decisions held firm. Justice, when it came, was swift and absolute. A week after the detainments, General Hale called his granddaughter. He told her he was proud, not for the outcome, but for the way she had carried herself throughout the entire ordeal. He said her father would have been proud, too. Avery thanked him genuinely, but she realized she no longer needed the external validation. She had proven something essential to herself. She kept showing up. She kept leading, teaching, and doing the difficult, unglamorous work of a tactical officer. Every time a young woman in uniform passed her in the hallway and offered that silent, knowing nod of respect, Avery remembered her father's core lesson. She was not a quota. She was not a legacy. She was proof. She would never stop. She would simply continue to prove them wrong again and again until they ran out of excuses. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. He answered on the second ring. Avery laid out the entire situation, every detail, every counterclaim, every fact, in the same cool, emotionless tone she would use for an after-action report. No tears, no anger, just clinical data. She recounted the cadet's initial sneer, "Women don't belong at Raven Ridge," and the sickening force of the shove. She described the pain of her cracked ribs and displaced wrist, and the bitter realization that the system's initial response was doubt, not defense. She detailed the counter-complaint, how her own disciplinary emails were being twisted into proof of her supposed hostility, and the sickening fear that her years of sacrifice would be erased by a calculated lie. General Colin Hale stayed silent for a long moment, processing the data of her latest battle. He was a legend whose commands had shaped decades of military policy, and his name still carried the immense weight of that legacy. Then just 3 words, spoken with the quiet, devastating finality of a command. "I'll handle it." The iron fist of authority. The next morning, the promise was fulfilled with surgical precision. A black SUV rolled right through the Raven Ridge gates. 3 men in civilian suits got out and walked directly into the superintendent's office, bypassing all protocol, no appointment, no warning. This was not a routine visit. This was an intervention. One of the men was a retired 4-star general, a peer of Colin Hale. Another was a current 2-star general who had once served alongside Avery's father, Captain Miles Hale, a Silver Star recipient. The third represented the powerful Office of Military Oversight. This was a meeting of shadows, an assembly of the military old guard who understood that certain families, families that sacrifice, families that bleed, do not forget. The cadets, Ethan Ward, Noah Briggs, and Ryan Tate, had failed to realize that their petty act of resentment had just triggered a response of catastrophic institutional force. Within an hour, the 3-star general who served as superintendent triggered an emergency lockdown order. It was an action of extreme severity, normally reserved for major security threats. Every single gate sealed shut, freezing all movement on the base. Classes stopped instantly. Every cadet was confined to barracks. Avery felt a cold sense of awe. This was not about revenge. This was about the absolute, uncompromising imposition of truth. The mystery of the 3 sudden generals was now the central focus of the entire academy, and the quiet, doubtful investigation that had initially failed her was about to become an overwhelming, unstoppable search for the facts. Her initial sense of anxiety was replaced by a strange, unsettling feeling of being protected by an almost mythical, invisible shield. The unstoppable search for truth. A high-level investigation team, backed by the pressure of the sealed gates and the oversight representative, moved with ruthless efficiency. They had 48 hours to find the truth. They weren't looking for a mistake. They were looking for a crime. They secured surveillance footage, phone logs, and compelled witness statements from every cadet nearby. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. The entire academy held in a state of suspended animation while the highest echelons of power hunted for evidence. They uncovered exactly what Avery already knew. The attack was not a spontaneous confrontation. It had been planned for weeks. Text messages were recovered, showing the cadets mocking her and actively scheming ways to drive her out of Raven Ridge. These were not impulsive acts. They were malicious, premeditated attempts to undermine her authority and her career. The security footage captured them waiting at the top of the stairwell, deliberately blocking her path, and then the final, violent shove that sent her twisting down the stone steps. The chain of custody for the phone data was airtight, lawfully seized. The proof was overwhelming. The entire narrative of a simple, tragic accident collapsed instantly. The cadet's counter-complaint, the accusation of harassment, and the claim that she had exaggerated her injuries, was exposed as a deliberate, organized conspiracy to obstruct justice. Avery realized the battle was never about her physical strength. It was about the silent resilience of her truth against the loud, chaotic clamor of their lies. Her father had taught her that strength of body meant little without strength of mind. This was the strength of mind, crystallized. Justice, swift and absolute. Within days, the resolution was absolute. The three cadets, Ward, Briggs, and Tate, were taken into custody by military police and marched off campus in handcuffs. Their arrogance, their resentment, and their misplaced confidence had delivered them directly into the hands of a judicial system that operates outside the allowances of college-age entitlement. Their commissioning was immediately revoked, and they were administratively separated from the academy pending court-martial. Their families, desperate, tried to intervene, hearing lawyers, calling it a gross misunderstanding. But none of it mattered. Formal charges were filed under the Uniform Code of Military Justice: assault, conduct unbecoming of an officer, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The entire process had moved from incident to detainment in less than a week. The quiet, methodical search for truth, backed by immense influence, had ensured that justice would be not only served, but served swiftly. Avery was summoned back to the superintendent's office where the three generals awaited. General Colin Hale was deliberately absent. He had allowed the academy to handle the resolution without the shadow of his direct influence, ensuring the integrity of the process and the final outcome. The superintendent, a three-star general, looked Avery directly in the eye, offering no vague speech or bureaucratic platitudes. He gave her a personal apology, admitting that the system had failed her. The offer of redemption. He explained that the investigation had exposed a deeper, toxic pattern of harassment against female cadets and officers at the academy, confirming Avery was not an isolated target. Immediate reforms were being rolled out, and a task force was forming to deliver a full report within weeks. The quiet suffering of one woman and the overwhelming response it provoked had forced a systemic reckoning. Then came the extraordinary offer, a choice. She could stay at Raven Ridge and continue as a tactical officer with the full, explicit backing and support of the leadership. Or she could transfer anywhere she wished, any branch, any base, with an included promotion and commendation. No pressure, no strings attached. The institution, battered by its own internal corruption, was desperate to restore faith and demonstrate a decisive change. Avery felt a deep sense of hopeful resolution settle over her. She knew instantly what she had to do. She refused the transfer and the easy promotion. She would not allow three cowards to drive her from the place her father had once dreamed of seeing her thrive. She would not be exiled. She chose to stay. She returned to duty, her left wrist still cased in plaster, her ribs still mending. The pain was still there, but now it was a marker of her refusal to quit. The cadets under her watch looked at her differently now, not with pity, but with profound respect. They had seen her stand firm. They had seen justice arrive exactly as it should. Her personal struggle had forced the truth out of the shadows. Did she really think the fighting was over? Avery returned to duty with her wrist still encased in plaster and her ribs still mending. The pain, a constant, dull throb, was a physical reminder of the betrayal she had faced, but it was also a stubborn source of strength. She had refused painkillers, choosing to remember every second. Now, that decision felt prophetic. She was back in her role as a tactical officer overseeing fourth-year cadets at Raven Ridge. This was meant to be an honor, a chance to mentor and uphold standards. Now it was a crucible. The new normal. The atmosphere in Jefferson Hall was fundamentally changed. The emergency lockdown had lifted, but the silence was different. It was thick with awareness. Every cadet on post knew what had happened. They'd seen the three senior men, Ward, Briggs, and Tate, marched off campus in handcuffs. They had seen the institution, usually slow and self-protective, move with surgical, overwhelming speed. The family name Avery had always carried, that weight of expectation and forgiveness for less, had acted as an amplifier, turning a personal injury into a public, undeniable moment of accountability. Avery knew the risk of staying. She was now a symbol, both of female resilience and of an unwelcome institutional shift. She faced a new, silent battle, the psychological pressure of 1,000 staring eyes. The cadets under her watch looked at her differently now, not with pity or sympathy, but with an intense respect. They had witnessed her stand firm against the lie, and they had seen justice arrive exactly as it should. This was a far more powerful currency than the easy, assumed authority of rank. The weight of the legacy. Her strength came from a well of memory. Avery thought about her grandfather, General Colin Hale, who had deliberately stayed out of the final proceedings, ensuring the academy handled everything without the shadow of his direct influence. He had done his part. He had activated the system. The rest was hers to bear. More profoundly, she thought of her father, Captain Miles Hale. His legacy wasn't about the silver star he earned or the life he gave. It was about his final lesson. The hardest part of leadership wasn't facing the enemy. It was earning trust from those who doubted you from the start. You just prove them wrong again and again until they've got no excuses left. This was the blueprint for her survival. She could feel the pressure of being watched, the subtle resentment from old guard officers, the whispered comments about a quota hire, and a commission based on her last name. They hadn't vanished. They had simply gone underground. The work of earning it. Avery refused to lean on the apology she'd received from the superintendent or the promise of reform. She knew that true respect was not granted, it was extracted through effort. She was back to her mission, to mentor, evaluate, and uphold standards. She pushed the fourth-year cadets harder. Her reports were precise, her evaluations unflinching. She expected perfection, just as her own father had expected it from her when teaching her to shoot at age 10. The fact that she was performing these duties with a heavy cast on her wrist and bound ribs only amplified the message. She never complained. She never slowed down. She ran her drills, taught her classes, and led her patrols, demanding nothing she wasn't willing to do herself, a standard she had lived by as a platoon leader with the 101st Airborne Division in Karash Province. This silent demonstration of unwavering discipline was far more effective than any command. The aftermath and the future. Over the next few months, the legal proceedings played out. The three who attacked her faced courts-martial. Ethan Ward received 6 months confinement and dismissal from service. Noah Briggs and Ryan Tate shared similar sentences, their records permanently marked and their names erased from Raven Ridge's rolls. Their families tried to appeal, but the decisions held firm. The justice, when it came, was absolute. A week after the final detainments, General Hale called his granddaughter. He told her he was proud, not for the outcome of the case, but for the way she carried herself through it. Avery realized she no longer needed that validation. She'd proven something only to herself. She belonged, not because of her lineage, but because she had earned it, every hard-won inch of it. She kept showing up, leading, teaching, and doing the work. And every time a young woman in uniform passed her in the hallway and offered that silent nod of resilience, Avery remembered her lesson. Prove them wrong again and again until they run out of excuses. But what happens when the enemy isn't external but a pervasive, institutional shadow? Avery was back in the uniform, back in Jefferson Hall, but the academy had changed around her. The three-star superintendent's personal apology and the promise of immediate reforms were a public acknowledgement of the system's failure. Yet, Avery knew that genuine change moved at the speed of human nature, not mandate. The investigation had exposed a deeper pattern of harassment against female cadets and officers. This meant Ward, Briggs, and Tate were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a culture Avery was now tasked with challenging, even in her injured state. The silent war of perception. Avery's daily life became a silent performance of grit. Her left wrist was immobile in the plaster cast, and every sharp movement sent a jolt of pain through her mending ribs. She ran her tactical drills, taught her classes, and presided over inspections with the same unflinching discipline as before. The injury was an undeniable vulnerability, but she refused to allow it to become a weakness. She would not let the three cowards who attacked her drive her from the place her father had dreamed of seeing her thrive. This was not just duty, it was a deeply personal act of defiance. She could feel the eyes on her. The young female cadets, the ones who had suffered the same subtle or overt disrespect, looked at her with a knowing, fierce admiration. They had witnessed her stand firm, and they had seen justice arrive exactly as it should. They offered silent nods of respect as they passed her in the hallway. But she also felt the cold scrutiny of the old guard, the officers and senior instructors who resented the sudden, high-profile intervention and the mandatory shift in inclusion policies. To them, she wasn't Lieutenant Avery Hale, an infantry officer and combat veteran. She was the Hale legacy, the catalyst for unwanted change, and the officer whose commission they claimed came from her last name. Leading by bruise. Avery chose to lead through her injury. She refused to retreat to administrative duties even after the order was lifted. She stood on the drill field, demonstrating movements with her non-dominant hand, correcting errors with clinical sharpness. She didn't seek sympathy, she demanded performance. The sight of her, unyielding, cast and all, was more impactful than any speech. It reinforced her father's lesson, prove them wrong again and again until they run out of excuses. This period became her greatest internal conflict. On one hand, she had the immense, institutional power of her family name that had sealed the gates and delivered swift justice. On the other, she needed to earn the respect of her cadets and peers based solely on her own merit, separate from that lineage. The knowledge that she possessed the ultimate recourse, a phone call to a four-star general, made her more vigilant about relying only on her professional capability. She reviewed the reform proposals coming down from the superintendent's office, contributing sharp, unvarnished critiques based on her experiences both as a cadet and as a tactical officer. The investigation had confirmed the cadets had been openly bitter about the academy's new inclusion policies. Avery realized her fight was not just against three individuals, but against a deep-seated culture that believed respect was a privilege reserved for a select few. The confinement and the conviction. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against Ethan Ward, Noah Briggs, and Ryan Tate moved through the Uniform Code of Military Justice, UCMJ. They were formally charged with assault, conduct unbecoming, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The airtight chain of custody and overwhelming evidence, the security footage and text messages, left them no ground for defense. Their families' attempts to appeal and call the incident a misunderstanding failed utterly. The trials, which unfolded over the next few months, were a mandatory public lesson for the academy. Justice, as General Hale had intended, was swift and absolute. All three were convicted. Ward, the most vocal proponent of their ideology, received 6 months confinement and a harsh dismissal from service. Briggs and Tate received similar sentences, permanently marking their records and erasing their names from Raven Ridge's rolls. Their dream of commissioning was dead. Their careers ended before they began. Avery tracked the outcomes not with gloating, but with the cold satisfaction of professional completion. The threat was neutralized. The standard was reaffirmed. The call and the conclusion. A week after the final detainments and convictions were announced, General Hale called his granddaughter. He didn't ask about her ribs or her wrist. He simply told her he was proud, not for the outcome, but for the way she carried herself through the entire ordeal. He echoed her father, Captain Miles Hale, saying he would have been proud too. Avery thanked him, but in that moment she realized the validation she truly needed had already been secured. She had proven to herself that she belonged, not because of her lineage, but because she had earned it, in Karash Province, on the steps of Jefferson Hall, and in the quiet resolve to return to duty. She had internalized her father's ultimate lesson, that leadership is a relentless act of proof. She kept showing up, leading, teaching, doing the work. She was Lieutenant Avery Hale, an infantry officer who had survived war and institutional betrayal, and she would not yield. She would simply continue to prove them wrong, one day, one drill, one corrected error at a time. Her victory was silent, but her impact was undeniable. The woman who had tumbled down the stairs was now the unshakable foundation of a changing academy. When she had fallen down the stairs, what else had she broken besides her ribs and wrist? Avery knew that the most insidious fracture had been the break in her belief that simple competence was enough. She was an infantry officer, a combat veteran, a tactical leader. She had earned her place. Yet 3 cadets had tried to tell her she didn't belong. She realized that the institution, for all its talk of standards, was still infected with a fundamental bias that questioned a woman's authority. Now, with the dust settled and the 3 perpetrators convicted, her job was to actively heal that structural injury within the academy itself. The task force in the shadow. The superintendent had announced that Avery's incident had exposed a deeper pattern of harassment against female cadets and officers. A task force was forming to deliver a full report and implement immediate reforms. Avery, the unwilling catalyst, was now an essential piece of that solution. She was placed on the internal working group, tasked with translating the cold facts of the investigation into workable policy. This meant hours of reviewing documentation, reading the veiled and open complaints of other young women, and confronting the toxic culture that had allowed her attackers to feel emboldened. She saw her own experience reflected in the stories of cadets who were called quota hires, or whose capabilities were constantly questioned. This work was exhausting, a different kind of war than the one in Karash. In the field, the enemy was visible. Here, the enemy was a pervasive, insidious shadow of historical prejudice. Avery felt a deep sense of responsibility. She was fighting not for her own reputation anymore, but for the countless women who followed her. She remembered her father's words, "You can't make them believe, you just prove them wrong again and again." Her current mission was to create a system where proving them wrong didn't cost a young officer cracked ribs and a broken wrist. Leading with the cast. She continued her tactical duties. The white plaster cast a stark, inescapable statement. She used it as a tool, not a handicap. During leadership drills, she would deliberately highlight how she adapted her movements, emphasizing that capability was defined by mind and resolve, not just brute physical force. She pushed the female cadets especially hard, not with malice but with a fierce belief that they had to be twice as good, twice as ready, because the old system expected them to fail. The cadets under her watch looked at her with a new depth of respect. They saw a woman who had been betrayed by her peers, failed by the system, but who had stayed. She had been given the option to transfer anywhere she wished with promotion and commendation included, but she refused to let 3 cowards drive her from the academy. That act of silent defiance spoke volumes. Avery understood that her presence, injured and unyielding, was the most powerful reform Raven Ridge could institute. She was the living embodiment of the new standard. She was the proof that the family name carried weight, not because of influence, but because that family name represented a commitment to seeing a fight through to the end, regardless of the personal cost. The quiet victory. The months passed, and the academy began to breathe differently. The superintendent's task force completed its initial review, and new, clearer policies on harassment and reporting were rolled out. Avery's quiet, factual input, her clinical relay of the facts without tears or emotion, had ensured the reforms were grounded in operational reality, not just political expediency. Avery's wrist was finally out of the cast, though the bone ached on cold mornings. She felt a quiet, professional satisfaction. She hadn't sought revenge, she had sought justice. She hadn't needed validation from her grandfather or her peers. She had proven something to herself. She belonged not because of her lineage, but because she had earned it. The true victory was not the conviction of the three cadets, but the sight of the young women under her command walking taller, their own confidence bolstered by her unyielding presence. She knew the fight wasn't completely over, but the ground had shifted. She would simply keep showing up, leading and teaching. Six. Had she truly found peace, or was she simply waiting for the next conflict? Avery continued her work at Raven Ridge, the academy transforming slowly around her. She was Lieutenant Avery Hale, the tactical officer who had refused to back down, the living testament to the fact that justice could be swift and absolute when forced into the light. The internal task force continued its work, and the superintendent had made clear his commitment to reform. Yet the military, like any massive institution, moved with the inertia of decades, and Avery knew that simply convicting 3 cadets didn't erase the cultural rot. The unending work of proof. Her days were a relentless schedule of patrols, evaluations, and mentorship. She pushed her fourth-year cadets hard, especially the women. She was not sympathetic, she was demanding. She had learned fast that strength of body meant little without strength of mind. Avery knew that the standard was not lowered for her, and it would not be lowered for them. She taught them to shoot, to study until their eyes burned, and to run until their legs quit and then keep running anyway. She was instilling a silent discipline, the kind that withstands scrutiny and doubt. She kept her father's lesson close, proved them wrong again and again until they've got no excuses left. Every time she corrected a flaw in a drill, every time she gave an unflinching evaluation, she was proving her right to be there, and implicitly, their right to be there. She belonged, not because of her lineage, but because she had earned it. The quiet pride she felt was anchored not in the applause of others, but in the internal knowledge that she had passed the ultimate test. The shifting landscape. The academy's atmosphere had palpably shifted. Where once there were open whispers of resentment, there was now a grudging, deep-seated respect. The cadets had witnessed her stand firm. They had seen the consequences of toxic arrogance. Avery's unyielding return to duty, even with her injuries, had given her an undeniable moral authority that rank alone could never grant. She felt a strange sort of peace now. The internal struggle between the weight of the Hale name and her need for personal achievement had subsided. General Colin Hale's intervention had forced the truth, but her choice to stay had defined her character. She was no longer fighting for her place. She was simply occupying it, firmly and without apology. She was the one leading, teaching, doing the work. The legacy of resilience. As the weeks turned into months, Avery focused on the next generation. She understood that her role was less about tactical instruction and more about cultural change. She mentored the young women, offering guidance that was grounded in her own harsh experience. Accept that people will expect more of you and forgive less, and if you want respect, you'll have to earn it twice. The most meaningful reward was the silent nod of recognition from a young female cadet in the hallway. It was a simple, wordless acknowledgement that Avery had fought their battle and won. It affirmed that the choice she made, to stay and continue as a tactical officer with the full backing of leadership, was the right one. She had turned betrayal into a foundation for others. The truth, when it came, was swift and absolute. She would continue to show up, ensuring that the next woman in uniform would find a path that was slightly less steep, slightly less treacherous. Her dignity hadn't spoken, it had acted. But what legacy does a true leader leave behind? Avery, now months into her second tour as a tactical officer, stood fully healed both physically and spiritually. Her wrist was strong, her ribs mended. The plaster cast was a memory, but the experience was permanently etched into her resolve. She was Lieutenant Avery Hale, and she had become a quiet, uncompromising force at Raven Ridge. The internal task force had concluded its work, delivering a full report and instituting systemic reforms that addressed the pattern of harassment her incident had exposed. The unspoken language of authority. Avery's authority no longer rested on her rank or the weight of her family name. It was rooted in the undeniable fact of her resilience. She had faced betrayal, endured physical injury, resisted the system's initial doubt, and returned to duty where others would have taken the easy transfer. This entire sequence had created an unspoken language of respect on campus. She was the one leading, teaching, doing the work. She continued to push the cadets, modeling the strength of mind that she knew was more vital than physical toughness. Her goal was simple: to create leaders who valued capability over gender and integrity over entitlement. She knew the fight against institutional prejudice was a constant, low-intensity conflict, but she was now fully prepared for it. The reflection of a father's lesson. Avery often reflected on her father, Captain Miles Hale, and her grandfather, General Colin Hale. Her grandfather had taught her that the family name carried weight, demanding she earn respect twice. Her father had taught her that the true struggle of leadership was earning trust from those who doubted you. She had done both. The family influence had paved the way for the truth to emerge, but she had earned the final, most important victory through her own tenacity. Avery had refused the administrative transfer and the quiet escape because she wouldn't let three cowards drive her from the place her father had once dreamed of seeing her thrive. That decision had not just saved her career, it had cemented her legacy among the cadets. They had seen her stand firm. The poetic moral. Her final actions embodied the moral reflection of her journey. Every time a young woman in uniform passed her in the hallway and offered that silent nod of respect, Avery felt the true weight of her victory. The nod confirmed that the cultural landscape was changing. She had turned an act of malice into a catalyst for justice, not just for herself, but for others. She continued to operate under her father's ultimate lesson: prove them wrong again and again until they run out of excuses. This was her peace. This was her unending mission, her commitment to the standards, to the truth, and to staying exactly where she belonged. That was the legacy of Lieutenant Avery Hale. And when the silence finally comes, what is left? Lieutenant Avery Hale stood on the parade ground, the autumn air crisp and cold, watching her fourth-year cadets march past. The three generals were long gone. The three cadets who attacked her were serving their time, their names erased from the academy rolls. The system had corrected itself, not because it was inherently good, but because it was forced to uphold its own highest standard by a decisive, overwhelming external push. Avery was the walking embodiment of that standard now, a woman who had endured physical pain, bureaucratic doubt, and the constant, subtle erosion of her worth, only to emerge stronger. The last battle. She felt a deep, enduring sense of self-redemption. The internal struggle between the weight of her family's name and her need for personal achievement had finally resolved itself. General Hale's influence was the lightning rod that struck the truth, but her choice, her absolute refusal to leave Raven Ridge, was the foundation of her honor. She had been given the chance for an easy transfer, a promotion, and a clean slate, but she understood that true victory wasn't escape, it was occupation. She would not be driven from the place her father had once hoped to see her thrive. She was here because she had earned the right to be here, and no amount of resentment or old guard skepticism could change that fact. She watched the young female cadets under her command. They walked taller now. They spoke with more authority. They had witnessed her battle, a quiet, brutal fight for dignity, and they had internalized the lesson. Avery realized the true measure of her success wasn't the convictions of her attackers, but the unshakable confidence of the next generation. The unending mission. Avery continued to teach, lead, and demand perfection. Her mission had evolved from personal survival to institutional stewardship. She was the one ensuring the new policies were enforced, that the cultural shifts took root. She accepted the fact that she would always be a target, always under scrutiny. But she no longer felt vulnerable. The scrutiny was just proof that her presence mattered, that the ground she stood on was hard-won territory. The pain from her injuries was a dull memory, but the resolve it forged was permanent. She knew she would always carry the heavy, beautiful weight of her father's final lesson. The hardest part of leadership is earning trust from those who doubt you. You don't make them believe. You just prove them wrong again and again until they've got no excuses left. The final beat. She watched the last rank of cadets pass, their steps sharp and synchronized. Lieutenant Avery Hale, an infantry officer, a combat veteran, a woman who had fallen down the stairs and risen to meet 3 generals, offered a simple, nearly imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. She would continue to show up. She would continue to lead. She was not a symbol of heroics. She was a testament to the unglamorous, unrelenting power of silent resilience. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.